during the intermission, we had music playing, Count Basie's band in Sweden. And then after that, we heard Count Basie's band live at Birdland with Lester Young playing the saxophone. So I'm sitting back there because he's my favorite saxophone player. So I'm sitting there saying, Lester Young, wait a minute. Benny was in the band that night. Down at Birdland with Lester Young. So I'd like to start the second half, Benny, by asking, Lester Young was from New Orleans.
Oh yeah, well, it was my great pleasure to meet him and to be around him, Buddy Tate, Freddie Green, all of those guys were the guys who were, had been in the band or were in the band when I joined. I joined Count Basie's band when I was, Harlem figures in that prominently because I was playing at the Apollo Theater with Joe Thomas. Joe Thomas was a saxophone player who had been with Jimmy Lunsford's band. I was just with the house band, and one of the members of that band was Charlie Folks, who was a baritone saxophone player with Count Basie's band. While we were playing on this gig, he told me that Basie was reforming again. At one time, Basie broke up his big band, and he had a 5-piece or 6-piece group with Clark Terry, Buddy DeFranco, etc. Well, during this rehearsal in 1951, it must have been like October, he told me that Basie was reforming, and if I was interested to come by a rehearsal. And I did, and we had a rehearsal, and I'm sure Basie didn't tell me, but I found out when the next rehearsal was. That was the deal, you know, you make a rehearsal and then you ask somebody when's the next time. So I came back at the next rehearsal, and the next rehearsal. Finally we started working with Billy Eckstein. Billy Eckstein had a band, and he broke up his big band. When Basie reformed, Billy Eckstein gave his bandstands that they used on the gigs and other equipment to Count Basie. He supported Basie totally as much as he could. When we started doing kind of weekends outside of New York, at this time I didn't have a permanent job, and I had a bid into Illinois Jacket and Charlie Ventura. That was the bands that I wanted to play with after I had left I had been with Lionel Hampton for about 3 years. We started doing these weekends, and since I had bids into other bands, I wanted a definite from Basie that I'm with the band and I could leave Illinois Jacket and those other people that I was bugging alone. So I'd ease up to Basie, and here I am, a 21-year-old kid, and this is world famous Count Basie. I'm still pitching myself to believe that I made a rehearsal with him, much less I'm doing these gigs. So I try to pose the question, did I have a gig? But I wouldn't do it that way. I'd say, Mr. Basie, how's the band? How do you like the band? He'd say, they're okay, kid. I'd say, well, how the trombone sound? They sound okay, kid. And he wasn't really a very gregarious guy. He gave you little short answers. So finally, after asking him this about, 5 or 6 times on various weekends when we would go out, I remember we were in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and we used to play this place that has this big water tank. I don't know how that figures in the story, but I remember that was the place. Finally, I said, Mr. Basie, do I have a job? The most I got out of him was, you're here, aren't you, kid? And I stayed there for 12 years. But he was a wonderful person. He was sort of like an uncle working, and he was, to me, he was a 5-star guy, and he really helped raise me, you might say, because I told you, my father died at a very early age, so I didn't really have that many role models. My role models became Lester Young, Freddie Green, Basie himself, and one of the things I loved about Count Basie, he taught me manners, sort of. No matter how old the lady was that you were coming to introduce to Count Basie, he always stood up to acknowledge her, whether she's your granddaughter or your grandmother. And I always thought that was, I'm still impressing ladies with that now. You know? But he taught me many things. He taught me minimalism because Count Basie wasn't a guy who was a big showy guy, you know. He would stick two fingers in the air and the band would explode, you know. One time I got a chance to, after Basie died, to lead the Basie band. And since I was going to be standing in front, it was in Zurich, Switzerland. Since I was going to be standing in front, I asked the trumpet player to send me the music that they were currently playing, because I hoped to get my little choreograph. When the band played this, I was going to do this and all that. Then I was at the same time doing a seminar at Brooklyn Conservatory, and it suddenly dawned on me that when I was with Basie's band, the whole time, in 12 years, he was at the piano. There was nobody waving their hands in front of the band like that. So I devised this way to make my presence known, but not get in the way, because I had played with the band enough times with people who didn't know what they were doing, conducting the band. One time we did a movie with Jerry Lewis called Cinderella.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I remember Jerry Lewis. After that, every time we played a nightclub, Jerry Lewis would want to come by and conduct the band. You know, and I know how frustrating that is. You're sitting up there trying to play and somebody's waving off. Anyway, I devised this way to make my presence known, yet not get in the way. So what I did was I asked them to give me a bar stool, and I put this in the crook of the piano and stuff, you know. So when and tonight, Count Basie Band, conducted by Benny Powell, I went to the microphone and made my initial thank you, and it's great to be here and leading the band and blah, blah, blah. I tried to keep it as short as possible because I remember Basie didn't say all of that stuff. So I would go and stand in front. I mean, thank you for being here, and now we're gonna play something, I don't know, whatever. But the tenor player would give me he's sitting there, I'm standing above him here. He would say, 1, 2, give me the tempo. So I'd say, oh, okay, a 1, a 2, a 1, 2. The band would get started, and as soon as they played a little bit, I would go and sit on my little piano stool, and there was nobody in front leading the band. And at this time, the band ran like a Rolls Royce, you know, they did it every night. So, in fact, when we got finished, the guys asked me if I would stay there and conduct the band, because I don't think that they had a leader at that time. And I was deeply honored to be asked, but in my own career, it would have been counterproductive, because no matter what I was or whatever, I'm still conducting Count Basie's band, and nobody would remember Benny Powell. He's the guy who conducted the Count Basie band, so it's still Count Basie. It wasn't a career move for me, but I always felt, and I was so nervous the night I got a chance to do it. I read this kind of, it's called Creative Thoughts, but it's thoughts that you read. I used to see old people reading these books and stuff, and I wondered what it was. Now I'm one of them old people reading these books. And this book said you're strong enough to do whatever you have to do. So that took the nervousness off my being there. But it was really like this. This is a magic night for me. Believe me, I don't take this for granted by any means, but you realize what a privilege it is to sit down and tell you about my life, and to have an interesting life enough to have how many bunch of people listening to me, you know. So this is a magic day for me.
Thank you, Benny. And also, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the thousands and thousands of people that are going to be watching you and watching this interview many years from now. But let me go back now to Ernie Fields, because we were talking about going from King Colax and that wonderful picture that you painted that first night. Talk about an awakening, and then tell us about Ernie Fields. He was in Tulsa, wasn't he?
Yes.
Okay.
Ernie Fields was more of a businessman than a trombone player. he played trombone, but he played third trombone in front of the band. Uh, as I said, he was a businessman, and I think maybe he had some businesses in Tulsa, I'm not sure. But it takes a businessman to run a big band. Uh, the organization that comes with business, most musicians don't have it because we've been busy trying to find out how many notes in a B flat 13th or whatever. But there were guys, in fact, in history, I don't know what Lucky Millinder played, but he had a big band as well. Ernie was a very good businessman, and he kept the band together for many, many years. By being a territory band, meaning that he worked in a territory most of the time, he's not too very well known. He didn't come to Chicago and play the clubs, or New York, or Philadelphia, or any other places. But he figures, I'm not sure, but I heard John Coltrane played with his band for a little while. I always say that big bands have been the incubators for all the stars. Dizzy's played with Cab Calloway, Charlie Parker played with J. Mac Shan. So to me, big bands have really, that's where many of the stars got their training.
That's why, just for folks who don't necessarily know what the term third trombone means, I looked over at Roland, we laughed, because you have to, there's a comedian named Pete Barbuti, and he has a comedy routine which is along the lines of what you're talking about, which is a guy who plays fourth trumpet leading a band. If you have a guy who plays the third trombone leading a band, playing his part, if you dance in front of the band when they're playing in the mood, you're going to hear da 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 da.
The harmony parts.
Right, you're going to hear a harmony part out in the middle, so it's kind of a funny thought. What kind of music did the band play?
Well,
was it as hip as the King Kolex band with the bebop?
In those days, we all had a standard music that you had to cover. You had to play some Tommy Dorsey arrangements, some Jimmy Lunsford arrangements. The recordings at that time were by big bands. So for the most part, we played what's called stock arrangements. And we played just about, it was music for dancing at that time. Recently, I've done seminars on swing, and people ask me about swing. What is swing? First of all, swing was the music created for people to dance. Now, when I tell some of my students that, they think that means ballet or something. I say, no, social dances where people touched each other. You know, for many years before dot-com society set in, I used to do these music appreciation classes for kids in schools. And I would always tell them that perhaps your grandmother or grandfather met at one of these dances. And, you know, when you go home, ask your grandmother about Jimmy Lunsford.
Yeah. So you're playing with Ernie Fields' band. How long were you there?
Until Lionel Hampton came through. That must have been 2 or 3 years. Lionel Hampton came through Oklahoma, and I don't think before or since has anybody been looking for a trombone player. I think my career has been sort of destined because there are too many coincidences. For instance, Lionel Hampton's trombone player had just left in Oklahoma City, and they were still on tour. Well, normally when that would happen, they would play a couple of dates and get to Chicago and pick up a musician where the pool is greater. Well, for some reason, after they left Oklahoma City, they played Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I don't know how they found out about me. Well, I guess somebody said there's a kid here who plays pretty good. So I joined Lionel Hampton's band. Years later, I found out, to my delight, that Betty Carter was known as Betty Bebop during those days. She was Lionel Hampton's sort of liaison as to who could play bebop and who couldn't, because Hamp was interested in staying modern. So I understand that after they heard me, she sort of gave me thumbs up, and I think she was sort of responsible for me joining Lionel Hampton's band. And that's when I began my national career.
Was that when you made your very first recording with Lionel Hampton?
Yes, I think so.
I see. Now, we were talking before about the realities of various parts of the music business. Now, truth be told, from what I can understand, playing Lionel Hampton's was not always a wonderful thing. in some ways in terms of the business and the way they treated the musicians and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I have to be careful about that because it's being documented, and I don't.
They're all gone. Nothing can happen now. But I'd like.
Yeah,
to...
but they're sons and daughters and grandchildren. I don't want them to come and beat me up.
Well, let me tell you why I asked. The reason I ask is, when I was younger, I got to work with Benny Goodman, and Benny Goodman has a reputation being cheap, and people always ask stories about Benny Goodman was like this, Benny Goodman was like that. Well, I was around Lionel Hampton too. I never played in his band, but I was around him and knew a lot of people who did. And I remember one night on the road, probably on a tour I was doing with you, but one night I wound up in a restaurant with Joe Wilder and Britt Woodman, who went off for 4 hours about 2 years in Lionel's band. And without trying to get to tell tales out of school or having people come looking for you, but I mean, could we get a realistic picture for people who look at it as like a nostalgic, wonderful, happy time that you're all just there playing and making a lot of money every night, not knowing how band leaders and managers used to take advantage of musicians?
Well, before I talked about these musicians who got restless in New Orleans and decided to go and join the army. Well, in the interim, after I wouldn't go join the army with them, maybe 2 or 3 years later, I was playing with Lionel Hampton on Broadway at the Strand Theater, and the doorman called upstairs and said, "Benny Powell, there's 3 soldiers who want to see you down here." So I went down, and there's all my guys from this little band, and they're in their army uniform, and I'm on Broadway playing with Lionel Hampton. I told you not to go and fight anybody. Go home and practice. Anyway, that was, to make a long story short, I could tell you about some tales, but I don't want to. After work with Lionel Hampton, 3 years, at this time I was 21. Between that and racial prejudice, I never did understand why anybody didn't like me before they even said hello. But that was sort of, that's what racial prejudice was. Well, with Lionel Hampton's band, I got a chance to play in Canada, and it was my first exposure to another kind of outlook on jazz. I think the head of the Jazz Society was a prominent judge, Judge Enger, in Canada. And during the time, I went to some showings. I think the first time I saw Oscar Peterson. It was a film. I didn't see him, but this film was an artistic film. It didn't show Oscar Peterson at all, but it showed the relationship of notes to color. As he would play a note, it would be another color on the screen. It was very interesting, and my first exposure to jazz societies and another outlook on jazz rather than the nightclubs and so forth. Well, after 3 months of Lionel Hampton and 21 years of racial prejudice, I decided I was through with all of it. I was going to become a Canadian. And I moved to a town called Hull, Quebec. It's right across the river from Ottawa. And at this time, I left Lionel Hampton's band and stayed there. And I think my room and board, I was staying at another musician's house, but I think room and board was like $10 or $15. And I could have stayed there the rest of my life, And I think some of the perks was I'd have tea with this guy's grandmother, who was British. So it was an exposure to a whole nother culture, a whole nother outlook on jazz. And I stayed there for a little while until my mother called and said at this time FBI had been looking for me because they thought I was in Canada dodging the draft. So I came back to New York, and as I was going back across the border, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, and immigrations or somebody woke me up and said, I told them why I had been in New York, and they said, well, do you plan to come back here and live? And I said yes, because I had. I told you I was through with racial prejudice and Lionel Hampton's tricks, whatever. I won't go into it. That's the 3rd time I've said that. I'm really not going to go into it. But that I moved to Canada for a little while. That was in 1951. That was just prior to my joining Basie.
So that's the Korean War. It
Wow.
was
That's
the,
the Korean War.
yeah.
Right.
50.
I don't know. All those
Korean
wars are
War.
the same.
Okay.
Wars about killing people, so I don't remember them.
Okay, so then how do we get from Canada to playing with Joe Thomas at the Apollo to be there to get the gig with Basie?
Well, that's in chronological order. I was in Canada, then, in a sense, I was deported back to New York. So at that time, that was the time when I was looking for a gig with Illinois Jacket or so forth. I'm working at the Apollo. I found out Basie was, so that's in chronological order.
Yeah.
One followed another.
Absolutely. All right, so we have you joining the Basie band in '51. You make this historic record session, I guess, for Columbia with Wardell Gray and Nails and that. Old Pony, are you on that record? Came in slightly.
John Hammond, Columbia Records, and with Buck Clayton actually.
Right.
Buck Clayton was the leader.
Really?
Yeah, and there were many fine musicians. Pete Brown was one that
Yes.
never got his full recognition, but he was with that first. Sir Charles Thompson. Just
On Vanguard Records, it was Vanguard, right?
it was Columbia at first.
It was Columbia.
Yeah, maybe they bought it and stuff. But John, I told you, John Hammond was. I've always been fortunate enough to have people who acted as uncles. Basie was like an uncle. I think now, in fact, many of my students call me Uncle Benny. I think uncles have a special place in society. I told you I was at an uncle's house where I discovered this trombone back there, you know. And I don't know, I believe uncles are a special privilege, especially in music, because your daddy will tell you, boy, shut up, you're making too much noise. Your uncle will say, keep playing, you're gonna be somewhere. So, you know, I've been privileged to have many uncles.
Well, could we start by talking about Uncle Lester Young, who also came from New Orleans, and about your time with him and
I just would like to sit in the corner and watch the rapport that he had with Roy Eldridge or Freddie Green. I don't know, those guys really, in fact, they were so tight, they almost created a language of their own. For instance, Lester Young, he did create his own language. And if you were around him, you learned to speak his language. Or, for an instance, if they were on the bandstand, Freddie Green, Lester Young would probably say whoever was standing next to him. Dick Tracy on the left dangle. No, that doesn't mean anything, but that means that two cops just walked in the house on the left entrance. So they had this whole language of their own. For instance, with Lester Young, when we started playing at Birdland, I had heard about all of this language. So one time, he had to go off the bandstand and walk through the hall to the dressing room. And I see Freddie Green, Lester Young, and maybe another one of their contemporaries. So I said, wow, I'm gonna find out what this whole language thing is about. So it took me about 15 minutes just to make a step. I'm walking so slow. So I passed by these guys on the way to get my coat from the back, took my time, heard every word they say, and took my time coming back. Didn't understand a word of it because they had made up their own language. They didn't, they had been together, and I think they loved each other so much. They were really tight throughout the Basie existence. Whatever members were from the Old Testament band used to come by, and the CD that you played of Lester Young at Birdland is one of my favorites. One thing, we were on tour. There used to be the Birdland tours of every year. This particular year, Lester Young was one of the stars. We played in Indianapolis, Indiana. And on my birthday, Lester Young had one of his friends make some gumbo for me. Now, I'll tell you what a chore that is, because gumbo calls for seafood. There's no sea near Indianapolis, Indiana. He found somebody, one of his friends, to get it all together, and I felt so honored and stuff. And now, I don't want to give the impression that I was Lester Young's bosom buddy, because at that time I was in my early 20s, and if I didn't know what to say to one of those musicians who had experience, I just sit in the corner and look at him, and pinch myself. I say, "Wow, that's Lester Young, that's Roy Eldridge, it's Freddie Green." It was like a dream come true that I still couldn't believe. And those guys were all very kind, very, very kind. In fact, they lived throughout Harlem and stuff. And I don't know, there was the jazz tradition. There are a couple of musicians who don't want to be called jazz musicians, and I can understand because they feel like it limits them. Randy Weston, the guy who I've worked with and I'm working with now, would prefer for his music to be called African rhythms. But to me, the jazz musician incorporates everything. Those guys that I saw when I was young, how they dressed, how they talked, and now how these guys address each other and stuff. So to me, jazz is a culture. Music is just one of the manifestations of it. How we dress, how we talk. As a matter of fact, I started doing, Eve Zani does every year at St. Peter's Church, she does a tribute to Lester Young. And sometimes I've had to talk about one of the contributions, jazz is offered so much to American culture and society. Before Lester Young, the word cool was a temperature, but he made it an attitude. Think about that. Now everybody's cool, president, but that's just one of the things, one of the jargons or one of the pieces that was created by jazz musicians. Hey, everybody's cool now, but think about it. Before Lester Young, it was just a temperature. It became an attitude with Lester Young.
And he also had, from what I understand, like just an attitude about music, an attitude about playing. I try and tell students sometimes that there'd be no Miles Davis if there wasn't a Lester Young, like that whole attitude, just the whole thing kind of,
Yeah.
And he must have stuck out so much in those early years when he was trying to do that. But to get back to your early years, so you joined the Basie Band, and this is a band that defined its own identity. You mentioned the Old Testament Band, which is what people call the Basie Band of the 30s and 40s. And then you joined this band in the 50s that's going to change the world with April in Paris and all these wonderful records. I'm wondering if you could, I'd like to mention some of the names of the people in that band, if you could just kind of tell us about them and how they were important. I'd like to start with Gus Johnson.
Gus Johnson was a drummer. I don't know what his, he was from Kansas City. And he played when I first joined the band. Gus got sick, he had some kind of challenge, and he went into the hospital, and at this time, Basie had some important gig coming up, getting to how Sonny Payne joined the band. And let me get also to the difference between the Old Testament band and the New Testament band. The Old Testament band was built on arrangements basically by Eddie Durham and some more writers, Jimmy Mundy and so forth. And the emphasis was on the soloist. Lester Young, Buck Clayton, Harry Edison. But Basie noticed that once the soloist got some prominence, he organized his own band. So Basie's always slick. When I would join the band, the emphasis was more on the arranger or the composer, Ernie Wilkins, and consequently, Ernie Wilkins, Frank Foster, Frank West, Sal Nestico, Neil Hefti. It's on the. So I always considered myself very fortunate because I just got under the wire of musicians who could make a name for themselves with the band and still last. Many musicians made names for themselves, but they're unfortunately not with us anymore. So I think, as a matter of fact, the guys who are left from Basie's band are few and far between. Joe Wilder and Frank West and Frank Foster are the ones that I can think of. But with this band was a trumpet player named Joe Newman from New Orleans. Oh, magnificent guy. Wendell Colley was from Massachusetts. We called him Professor, because he always wore a suit and a shirt and a tie. That's another thing. The musicians in those days used to be impeccable. They wouldn't come out unless they were clean to the bone, you know. So they'd just come out and sometimes just walk up and down 7th Avenue. So, but to me, that represents the highest of, because what you have on shows people what you think about yourself. You ever think about that? Because, and those guys were impeccable. They taught me how to dress, they taught me everything, you know, the guys from that band. Let's see, there was Charlie Folks. Well, let me finish with the trumpet players. Snooky Young and Thad Jones.
Now, who's the trumpet player who played with one hand?
Runal Jones.
Right.
He was really a product of Harlem. He was there, I think, in the early years.
Right.
And then the trombones, when I joined the band, were Jimmy Wilkins, Ernie Wilkins' brother, and Matthew G.
Yes.
Matthew G was an excellent trombone player from Texas. He could play a ballad and make everybody cry. I can't remember, Out of Nowhere was one of the ballads he played. You see, I got my education on Sunday nights in New Orleans when the big bands came through. And I heard everybody, Billy Eckstein, just all of the big bands, every Sunday night.
At that time?
I didn't hear Duke in New Orleans because I think Duke and Cab Calloway were sort of kind of above it all because they weren't as accessible. You see, when Duke's band would play in the South, rather than be subjected to prejudices of hotels, Duke and Cab Calloway would just rent a railroad car, a sleeper car, and that would be the hotel. They would park on a special place, and after the gig was over, they all went back there. Those guys were, I don't know what the word is, but people who are logical, who are great planners and so forth. I think those guys were. Let's see, who else was with the band? Frank Foster, Charlie Folks, Billy Mitchell was saxophone player. And at this time, Eddie Jones, a couple of guys came in and left, but Eddie Jones was the sustaining one.
Right.
And, sorry?
Was it on bass?
Eddie Jones was on bass, yeah.
Sure. Can I just go back to the trumpet section for a second? Because I'm just curious, 'cause you had, Joe Newman, who had been in the band back in the 40s, and then he came, and then he came back, and then
From New Orleans also.
right, that you mentioned, and then you mentioned Thad Jones, and of course, who later went on and you played in his band with Mel Lewis and just tell us about how did Thad Jones fit into that band, and was he like a guy who was like kind of pushing against the edge of it a little bit? Musically, his playing is so wonderful and so creative. What was he like?
Oh no, well Basie was always open for expansion, as long as it fit the mold of still being swinging and so forth. So Thad was very technically advanced, but you could still have, how can I put this? I remember one time I was trying to describe Thad Jones's band to Gerald Wilson on a radio show. I know what it was. I said, Thad Jones is sophisticated, but he's still sanctified. I mean, he still has that basic beat, all those millions of notes, you could still dance to it. And that's Basie being open to things that were advanced as long as it stayed in the mode of swinging.
Sure. Who played lead trumpet for the most part?
Snooky.
It was Snooky.
Oh yeah. Well, it was great for me because at that time I started playing bass trombone, and bass trombone is at the bottom register. So when you listen to a big band, to hear the lead trumpet player playing so beautifully and so clearly, you can hear all of that and stuff. So he was just great to play with. He's still playing with the John Clayton big band.
Right.
And somebody just saw him, Frank West just saw him in California 2 or 3 weeks ago. He has a problem hearing, and they were saying it's a marvel that he can still play with a big band and still having hearing problems. I don't know, the music is magical, I know.
Could you tell us about Henry Coker?
he was just a great guy. Henry Coker was from Texas, but I think he had lived in Hawaii for a while, and he was an excellent lead trombonist, an excellent soloist, and just a great guy with a great sense of humor. I know we had, I think, he was kind of weird. He would nickname people things like "sweet happy horse meat." where does that come from? But also, I guess I'm trying to get to his uniqueness. He was still a Texas guy, but I don't know. That band for 12 years, it was just like one big, long, fun day. He was an excellent trombonist, but after a while, Al Gray, who was a fantastic trombonist, I lived in Al Gray's shadow through Lionel Hampton and through Count Basie. And Al Gray was so fantastic, he would get all the trombone solos, and I'd be sitting up there just wishing for 12 bars here or there. But I understood it because, like everybody else, I thought Al Gray was a fantastic trombonist, and he got the solo part. So, in a sense, that's why you don't know too much about Henry Coker, because Al Gray was so overpowering and such a showman.
Tell us about Marshall Royal and what he meant to the band.
Well, Marshall Royal was a funny kind of character. He was from California, and I found that most people who were born in California and raised in California never got along with New York. They think New York is dirty, and they think you get robbed and so. Anyway, Marshall Royal always looked down on New York as being dirty and so forth. Marshall was the musical director, and he himself was a fantastic lead alto saxophonist, but he was also one of those guys that had done everything, been everywhere. If you had a 1938 Cadillac, he had a 1937 Cadillac. Oh yeah, whatever it was, he had one that was a year earlier than yours and 2 years better. You know? So consequently, and he used to be kind of rude to people. So he was never rude to me, but I'd sit up and plot, and I'd say, if he ever says such and such a thing to me, I'm going to say this to him. And I don't even mind naivety, I'm a young, dumb kid. He never did say anything bad to me, but he was a disciplinarian, and consequently it shows in the band, because he sure had the saxophone tight. He had the whole band pretty tight because of his attitude. But actually he was a sweetheart kind of guy. Basically always stressed in us that no matter how different our personalities were, we were family and we must get along. I don't remember anybody fighting in Basie's band the whole 12 years I was there.
Can you tell us about the Midgets?
The Midgets, when we worked at Birdland, the band was broken up into two different groups. That was the Midgets and the Bombers. I guess we're all sophisticated now enough to be able to say this. I can't remember whether the Midgets, I think the Midgets were the pot smokers and the Bombers were the alcohol drinkers. So after a while, we had a baseball team that used to play. Oh, the funniest thing in the world was to see Lester Young being pitcher on our baseball team, because Lester Young's mannerisms were very misunderstood. Many people thought he was homosexual because his movements. Anyway, when he would toss the ball and sort of like a lady, and when he tossed the ball, he said, "Hit that, sucker." I can't really describe him because he lived in his own world and stuff. But very sweet man, and I think very much misunderstood. I don't know if it was the privilege, but he played with Basie's band um, during his decline as well. I remember being in one of those state-of-the-arts auditoriums in Europe and hearing him play, and when he was at his biggest challenge, it was so mournful to hear him play because he had kind of lost his technique and so forth, but he would play whatever he could, and it was really a struggle. And to hear him play, I almost brought tears to your eyes, because you could, I think the same, I've been told, I wasn't around her that much, but I think Lady Day suffered the same thing when they sort of lost their really shining star. They still went out and played and did the best they could, but it was kind of hard to, I don't know, it's kind of hard to see Joe Louis get knocked out, you know, everything must change for everybody, you know. But Lester Young was something, I feel very fortunate to have known him.
In the course of your years with Basie, I mean, you've already mentioned a couple of names. I mean, the Basie Band, and you worked with everybody in show business, right? I mean, all those television shows and all those record dates, and Sammy Davis and Billy Eckstein and Judy Garland. I have a TV show of Judy Garland singing with the band, and all these people. And I don't even know where to start to ask you about those things, but could you just share with us with Frank Sinatra and all these people, just some of the wonderful moments that you experienced?
Well, I don't know if this is to answer your question. I did the Merv Griffin Show for about 10 years, and the Merv Griffin Show was made up of ex-big band players, either Duke Ellington's band or Stan Kenton's band, Woody Herman. It was because we had that experience of playing with everybody, you know, for everybody. As a matter of fact, as you mentioned, Judy Garland and all of that, we played for a lot of the Birds groups, the Orioles, this and that and stuff. We played with a lot of rock and roll groups as well. So you can see that gives you a hell of an experience playing. So when I was playing the Merv Griffin Show, we used to have to play the B.B. King and then Jan Pierce and then an opera star after that. But we were all trained to handle all of those things, so it stood in our stead. Oh, I can remember, I guess one of the slickest things was the movies we made, because we didn't make that many movies, but this Blazing Saddle, I'm sure you've seen that, where the guy is on the horse and this beautiful, I can't remember, what's the actor's name? Cleavon Little. Well, he's on this beautiful horse, I'm sure you've seen this, and Cleavon Little was just really very hip in that movie. Anyway, he's on this horse and he rides out to the desert, and way in the middle of the desert, there's Count Basie's band. He gives Basie 5 and then rides off, you know. Speaking of that, there was adventure in that too, because that particular morning when we shot that movie, we left Los Angeles maybe about 7 o'clock in the morning and rode to the desert. So when we get to the desert, we see where it's all set up. But then I think the band had one trailer and Count Basie had another trailer. So we hear in Basie's trailer all of this beating around and, you know, and stuff. And we wondered what it was. Well, Basie was wise enough to know this is a desert, so snakes might have crawled in this trailer. So he's beating around to get the snakes out of his trailer. Well, that was great fun.
Tell us just a bit about Count Basie's piano playing and what it was like to sit and hear that for 12 years in a row.
He was a better player than people acknowledged, gave him credit for. Because he decided to take the Menabille route, plink, plink, plink. Many people didn't realize what a great piano player. But he came up with the great Harlem Stride piano players. I think Fats Waller was his mentor, James P. Johnson, and so he could play much better than people gave him credit for.
I have a little clip. I just want to play this real quick. This is you with the band in Sweden in 1954, and you guys were playing something called Peace Pipe. But at the beginning of it, Basie put some stride piano, so I thought it's Mike that as long as you mentioned it, we'll hear that.
The band said, "Who's back in town?" Who's back in town? Let me tell you about it.
Let me tell you about it. You have no idea what that conjures up for me. All of a sudden, I felt like I was back on the bandstand. I think for about 12 years, I pinched myself because the band would be swinging so hard, it would feel like the band was going to levitate off the stand, you know. I pinched myself believing, I said, no, this can't be real, and this can't be little Benny Powell from Murray Street with Count Basie's band here in Sweden or Germany or wherever we were. It's always been kind of unbelievable. This whole music business is fantastic, and especially when you get into it at such an early age. I don't know, I can't really describe what it is. I'm looking at this young trombonist. He's just going through this stuff and I'm sure he's going through some of the same thing, some of the can this really be me style thing, you know, because it's fantastic. There's a lot of downsides to it, but for the upside, it's all worth it.
Benny, I'm wondering if you could tell the audience about when you hear a record like that, what you're hearing is this ensemble in which every single person on that stage has an equal role in what happens, and so many times the soloists get the attention and all this kind of stuff happens, but could you talk about that, about the importance of being a great ensemble musician and what made that band sound?
Well, I think it has to do with the arranger. When you're playing lead, you're playing the melody. But when you're playing harmony parts, a lot of times you feel like it's harmony. But when it's written so well, as Thad wrote it, Ernie Wilkins, Quincy Jones, everybody feels like they've got a lead part. And it's written so melodically, it's easy to play. And it's easy to play together, especially when you hear the harmonies and stuff around you, and you're all working towards the same effort. The rhythm section is cooking, and you're riding on top of it and stuff, and I don't know, it's just almost like an out-of-body experience. It gets that good. With all of that stuff churning around you, drummer, and this drummer, Sonny Payne, was just fantastic. In the little breaks while the band is not playing, you can notice all of the stuff that he's doing. When you sort of break it up, I teach an ensemble now, and I teach that big bands are made up of sections. We had the brass section, saxophone section, and the rhythm section, and we all vied with each other for excellence. We all had a great pride in making our section the best. Now, when you add all of that best together, you really got some power. I think he's...
I don't know, we're fine. We're fine. We're just getting a report on how much time he has before he has to change his tape. Whoa, everybody okay? So, Benny,
Yes.
you're with the Basie Band all those years. What about your, without intruding, but like, what about your personal life? How could you have a life and a home, and when you're on the road for 12 years, what happened?
Well, it's difficult. It really is difficult. I only have one daughter, and I wasn't at home when she was born. It's difficult for wives, and it's difficult for musicians as well, because it's a lot of fun. You get a chance to meet a lot of ladies, and that part is really fun. But if you have three sisters, meeting a lot of ladies treats you that you don't want, tells you you don't want to take advantage of that. Having a home life was very difficult. I've been married 3 times, so that should tell you something.
I remember I was interviewing, this has nothing to do with you, but I was interviewing Artie Shaw once, and he said, I've been married 9 times. I said, really? He says, yes, and the drag is that they keep asking me like I'm some kind of expert in marriage. He said, I'm an expert in divorce. the wrong question, but okay, so what happened at the end of 12 years, and why did you leave the band, and what happened?
But to answer your first question, during the time I was with Basie, I had a daughter, and I had a marriage. I had a nice house in Long Island. I had a Mercedes-Benz, a nice job with Count Basie, and a nice young daughter on the horizon. Here, rather. But I got a divorce very early, before my daughter really got a chance to see me at home, because I knew it was headed that way. So you have to make some decisions because of your career. Actually, when you're in music, you're almost married to music. The commitment's so strong. Even before you get to anything, you got to spend a bunch of days practicing. Well, wives understand that for a little while after they marry you, especially if you were with the band and stuff. But when it gets to that point where, hey, you're spending more time with music than you are with me, you have to say, well, you remember when you met me? That's how I was with Count Basie, So it becomes very difficult, and anybody who can maintain it for a long time certainly wins my respect. There have been musicians. Snooky Young is married to his wife for a very long time. Anyway.
How did you? What was it when you decided to leave the Basie Band? How did it happen?
Well, I figured I had been there long enough. As a matter of fact, I tried to leave the Basie Band 2 or 3 years. Every time it was amicable. Count Basie understood, and I would go to him and say, well, I think I want to stretch out and play with smaller groups and stuff. And he understood very well, but he said, well, it's too bad that you picked this time to leave, because we're going to Sweden next month. And I said, well, I don't have to leave right now. I still got a few more years. And that went on for a little while. But I left mainly because it was time for me to grow. After 12 years, sure. I had, kind of used that. But I left with Count Basie's blessings. And I'm fortunate enough for him to document that there's a book, Good Morning Blues, yes, about Basie's life story. But Basie was a wonderful blessing to me then, and still is. As I said, he's still blessing my life.
So where did you go when you left, Benny? Did you settle in New York first?
Yeah, I started doing Broadway shows. I did Barbara Streisand's first show, Funny Girl, on Broadway. Again, I'm sure when I was, well, I meant to talk about that for a little while. It's odd how, I think I got the Broadway show because of the Watts riots. It's funny how one thing affects another. In the Watts riots, I'm sure we all know that many people who were up here, well, not really that up, but the people who didn't have much lost even more. People like myself who were sort of halfway up the rung got kicked upstairs because you know, the volatile situation, and at this time there was a push for more African Americans on Broadway. And I was very fortunate to be one. Again, I'm sure when they offered my name to the promoter, producer of the show, they said, Benny who? They said, oh, Benny Powell. He used to be with Count Basie. Oh, I'll tell him come right in. That's the story of Count Basie, blesses my life. I did his show, did Funny Girl for about 3 years, and then I did Golden Boy. That was Sammy Davis's show. Well, I did Broadway shows for a while. Funny thing happened on the way to the Forum and stuff. But my day was very diversified during those days. In the morning, I would do what was called a jingle. That was a commercial about a product and stuff from maybe 9 to 12. From 2 to 5 or 7 to 10, I did what was called sweetening. That meant a lot of recordings had already been done. They had to add trombones so I might have done that. And then at night I would go to do Funny Girl. When I'd finished that, I'd run home and change clothes and then go down to the Vanguard to play with Thad Jones and Mel Lewis. So I'm a multitasker anyway. So this was right down my alley and stuff. I do like 4 or 5 things in the course of a day. And I lived Midtown, I still do. But during each task, I would go home and change clothes. Because for the commercial thing in the morning with products, I had to wear a suit and tie and stuff. And then I would go home and change. And then I would wear more leisurely clothes to go and do the recordings, rock and roll recordings. And of course I didn't have to change, but so much for the Broadway shows. But I've always known the advantage of looking well. So after I'd get finished Funny Girl, I would go home and change clothes again, and then go and play with Thad Jones and Mel Lewis. So to me, that provided a beautiful, diverse kind of day.
I don't know, again, just to make sure that everyone in the audience appreciates the high level of professional skill that the kind of work that Benny was doing at that time. It's what they call studio musicians, and these were people, or he is the kind of person, I should say, these were, put down any kind of music, any key, anything, and they go into a recording studio, put the music down, that red light goes on, and the band is such a crack band that they just play it down, and once or twice, and at such a high level of professionalism. That's one thing that I lament for the younger players coming up. I came up at the tail end of it, but that kind of situation, broadness of musical expression, doesn't really exist for young folks anymore. There's very little of
No,
that
I think
kind of work.
that shrunk up so much until just the guys who were doing it. Changing times,
Yeah,
changing.
sure. So I know that when I looked at your discography that you made, at the same time that you're doing Broadway shows and all this, you're still doing jazz record dates, and you did some dates with J.J. Johnson and just so many different people. I mean, tons of records that you made at that time. And then you move out to the West Coast.
Well, when I'm glad you brought that up, because people don't know how much jazz has really influenced things. It was because of Rahsaan Roland Kirk that Count Basie moved to California. Now, you'd never put these two guys together, but Merv Griffin and Rahsaan Roland Kirk. During the time I was doing the Merv Griffin show, Rahsaan and I had a conversation about getting more African American musicians on Broadway. And he said, of course, I'm all for that. So he said, well, we have a plan. We're going to disrupt one of the shows so we can make our point. So I think at first the plan was to hit the Dick Cavett show. So that's fine. He called me and asked me when did we take our breaks and so forth, so they would know how to plan their strategy. Then he called me about a week later and he said, well, we've changed the plans. We're going to hit the Merv Griffin show. And I said, well, that's great. That's fine. But I said, I have to be frank with you. It's a nice gig for me. So I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to walk off the stand in protest. I'm being upfront with you. He said, well, I appreciate that because you've helped us with the other things, so forth. So he respected that. Anyway, we were doing the Merv Griffin show from West 48th Street. We took this break to go and eat, and when I come back, I see all of these Ron Jefferson, all of these renegade musicians who would hang out at Slugs at night, standing in line. I know they weren't there to catch the Merv Griffin show. So, in fact, I went back into the theater with a kind of smug look on my face. Wow, I'm inside of this. I felt like I was in a German spy movie, you know, I'm inside this coup. So, I remember the show was going on, and I remember Merv was interviewing Jose Limon. That's one of the guys. So, as he's talking to Jose, I hear kind of rattle, jungle noises. You know, these things that you, wah, 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 and stuff, and then crickets and stuff. I hear him coming from the balcony. And it was funny to me to watch Merv Griffin and the producers, because they had no idea what was happening. So, a few minutes later, well, it looked like Merv was practicing magic himself. He just disappeared. I didn't ever see him leave, go out of any door, anything. Well, by this time, the guys have come down from the balcony and they're walking down the aisles. So Merv sent his producer out to find out what was going on. Well, he found out, and so it disrupted the show, and we had maybe 2 or 3 shows ahead in the can anyway. So we didn't finish the show that day. When we left, they said, well, we'll call you to tell you when we're gonna shoot again. So I think the next call I got was saying that the show was moving to California. There was great pressure during those times, peace movement, flower children and so forth. Anyway, I got the call saying the show was moving to California, and if I paid my way out there, I'd have a job. Well, I always wanted to live in California with a job anyway. So I went to California and stayed for 10 years. But during the whole 10 years I was there, I never stayed in Los Angeles a full month. We used to tape the show 3 weeks in Los Angeles and 1 week in Las Vegas. At this time, I was also married to a young lady who had background singers, and she'd be in Vegas as well. So, not in the whole 10 years, I never stayed there a month because my daughter was growing up. I'd come back and forth to New York. Then I was still doing tours with George Wein in Europe and so forth. I've always been a multitasker. That's why I got all these credits or whatever. I did the Merv Griffin show for 10 years, I think. And when that played out, somehow I lost my point, and it was...
You took me far away too, because I was just following you.
Yeah.
But my question was, well, you talked about, I asked you how you moved to California with Merv Griffin, and then you said it was all because
Russ Unruh.
Because of Russ Unruh and Kirk doing that, and so then you moved out there. Now, when you moved out there, you had been kind of like a king in the New York studio scene. You were getting all the great calls and all the record dates. I mean, you were at the top of the list. Now, all of a sudden, you pick up roots and you go out to California, which has its own studio guys and guys that have been there for 100 years. How did you fit into that scene?
Well,
you were welcome.
Me and the other guys, a couple of other guys, just kept our New York hustle. And before long, we were doing movies, doing all. In fact, we used to go to a club and play. In fact, we had a band with the same guys. And a lot of times, people would refer to us as us being the guys who transplanted New Yorkers as the guys with the suits, because we always had our suits on, and we started doing movies and all the things that the California guys were doing while they were at the beach. We were taking their gigs, you know, and stuff. It was just because we came out with our New York attitude, and before long, we did very well. I got a chance to, but also we kept our jazz thing together. Bill Berry had a big band. There were many big bands I played with and recorded with many big bands in California. And again, the fact that I had played with Count Basie just opened the doors for me with everything. So I got a chance to do all of that good stuff.
At this point, because it is getting kind of late, first of all, I'm going to say I hope you'll accept our invitation to come back for a part 2. And second of all, this is the point at which we open it up to our audience. Anybody would like to say anything, or questions, answers from the audience? Anybody? Paula?
Were you in the Basie band when Neil Hefti did brought Little Darling, and I think it was supposed to be an up tune, and then Count had something to do.
This lady's asking about Neil Hefti's arrangement on one of Basie's most famous ballads, Little Darling. There is a story that Basie, and it is true, had a hand in everything. When somebody would bring him an arrangement, he knew how to hear the parts of it that were, he knew how to hear the essence of it. And when Neil Hefti, famous arranger, he had worked for Woody Herman before that, I believe. When he brought this band, this song, Little Darling, the tempo was dee do 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 dee, like a dance tempo. Basie broke it down to almost hypnotic ballad. Dee do 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 do. Basie could see the worth in all of it. That's why he was Count Basie. And he could also see how something modern would still fit with his band, but keep his essence. He controlled that essence of the band, how the band played and how they played anything.
You know, Benny's also on this incredible record of the Duke Ellington Band and the Count Basie Band.
Oh, yeah.
Can you imagine being in
There was
one
a
studio
thing-
with the Basie Band and the Ellington Band?
What was that?
I could go into that, but I saw some more hands with questions.
Questions.
Did that slight invasion help more black musicians get
Was-
Did the thing that Rasan do actually help black musicians get?
Yes, did the thing Rasan's demonstration actually help black musicians? It did. I went to California, but when I came back, it was so funny because all of this black-white stuff is so ridiculous. When I came back, maybe 5 years later, almost all of the shows had black bands, almost predominantly black bands. And I said, wait, they weren't supposed to go that far overboard. It really did. It made, Rasan got his point across. He made more people aware, and even aware not only of being capable of doing something about it.
Questions? Russ?
Can you tell us about your first trombone? How old were you? What kind it was, if you recall? And is that what you played up until Tommy Dorsey's gift?
Oh, this young man asked about my first trombone. Naturally, he's a trombone player. I can't remember. I think when I was with Basie's band, the Kahn Company used to give me trombones for endorsement. Before that, I can't remember what I played, but I'm sure it was not of much worth. But in those days, and right now we're sophisticated, we need to have our slide working and all of this stuff. In those days, you just picked up a horn and played whatever you could play through it, and we swung like hell on some student instruments, with King Colex's band. I'm sure I didn't play a decent trombone until much later.
Question in the back.
Yeah, it's kind of like a controversial question. I've heard some people say that Count Basie's swing band was better than Duke Ellington's swing band.
The gentleman said this is a controversial question because he heard that Count Basie's band was more of a swing band. Well, that was always erroneous because Count Basie's effort was to play for dancers. Duke Ellington's band was not. It happened to be a very good band, but Duke Ellington's band was more about painting pictures and colors. It was actually about you sitting there and closing your eyes. The composition on Harlem has Harlem Traffic and all of that. So Duke's music, I think, was more descriptive of Duke and my people and telling stories and stuff. Basie's band was about people dancing and having a good time.
I can answer that because I worked with Count Basie at the Apollo. I was, I believe, 17 years old. It was my first time on stage. And standing behind those curtains, you know, they had a place where it was marked off where you stand. And when that band struck up, you could feel the vibrations of the music coming up from your feet all the way up through your body to the top of your head. And it was swing, yes, it was swinging. And it was for dancers. So I could answer that very well.
If you had a heartbeat at all, it would affect you.
It's overwhelming. Beautiful.
Well, that was always, I think maybe that might have been a thing, a journalistic thing. All of those,
Yes.
all of those some of those kind of myths are,
The jazz writers, right?
yeah, old jazz writers that make controversies out of it, and there's more on the right because there's the sort of feud between Dizzy Gillespie and Louis Armstrong. There was no feud; they both respected each other to the greatest. But also a lot of like battles of bands that was created. In fact, this band when Basie recorded with Duke Ellington, it was billed as a battle, but we weren't battling. I don't know, in music and jazz, there's been more harmony than battles.
Amen. Any more questions over here? Yes, son.
Joe Williams.
Oh, God, we didn't talk about it.
Can you talk about
Who's-
him?
Joe Williams.
Oh, Joe Williams, yeah. Oh, Joe Williams was a godsend to Basie. I think Basie called him his number one son. I don't think Basie had a son, but he made. Anyway, the band had been, at first, when we first started in 1951, we were surviving on tours with Ruth Brown singers and stuff. That was, we didn't have any major singers with the band until Joe Williams joined the band in 1955, I believe. We made the first record, Every Day I Have the Blues. Well, there were a number of things that catapulted Basie up another level. That was one of them. And another thing is when we played presidential inaugurations for Kennedy. After we did that, we became like America's darlings, and we found ourselves playing private parts on estates, parties on estates for the rich and famous in society. So Joe Williams was really a godsend. I think without Joe Williams, I don't know if the band would have been as popular, because singers always make stuff popular, and singers seem to have a longer, longevity than instrumentalists somehow. I don't know, it seems that way to me. But Joe was a marvelous singer, and Joe was really almost like a jazz musician, the way he phrased and so forth. But he was a great guy, and there was always a battle between Joe and Basie, because Joe always wanted to be a ballad singer. And Basie had made his reputation of being a blues player with Jimmy Rushing and the other great blues singers. Billy Eckstine playfully once said, there's Joe Williams up there singing ballads looking like the blues. You can put your own spin on that, whatever you want. But he was a great guy, and I loved him very much. We had in common the fact that both our mothers were domestic workers, and had done all of this stuff with us through just being, domestic worker. I loved him.
And sort of another record you want to see. This at some point I got to stop because you had made so many great records, but I just thought of one called No Count Sarah.
Oh yeah.
With Sarah Vaughan with the Basie band, but without Count Basie playing the piano. I think with Jimmy Jones or someone like that on the piano.
Jimmy Jones.
It must have been something working with Sarah Vaughan and Basie too.
Oh man.
Yeah.
I don't think these folks are gonna get anything to eat tonight because we could go
So
on.
we'll come back
because
for part two, but before we do, I want to, and before we thank Benny and present him with the plaque we have for you, I'd like to tell you about our upcoming events, so you will come back. Let's see, today's Thursday. Tomorrow night we have a concert downtown at the Rubin Museum of Art. A wonderful young trumpet player named Russell Gunn is going to be playing. Next Tuesday night we're continuing our Jazz for Curious Listeners down at the church down the street. Next Thursday night we're having Johnny Colon, who is one of our Harlem Speaks guests, a wonderful Latin band leader, and he also sings like Frank Sinatra. He's very good. He's doing a gig for us next Thursday night. And then it goes on and it goes on after that. On November 30th, our guest for Harlem Speaks will be a Harlem legend, Ross Carnegie, who was actually here earlier tonight. I think he had a gig, he had a split. And then the drummer Eddie Locke will be here. And then coming up on December 21st, a very obscure person who likes jazz, but we like to give people a shot sometime. We don't do just also his name. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar will be our guest. And but I'll tell you something, names and aside, this has been an absolutely magical night. And on behalf of everybody here, thank you for sharing your story with us and your vibe. And we hope you'll come back soon.
It's been my pleasure. It's been my pleasure. I hope for every one of you get a chance to sit in the seat and tell people about your life story. Because I'm telling you, I haven't had a drink or smoked any dope, but I'm as high as I am. Thank you. Thank you.